Good morning. Thank you all for being here. This is an extended housewarming at Kid Museum, and we really appreciate everyone being here for opening week in our new space. And we are thrilled to be able to gather for this really important discussion today. So appreciate everyone making their way out in the world today. We know we're still getting used to all of our live and in-person events again. Before we jump into the dialogue today, we do want to take a moment to acknowledge what happened, the tragedy in Texas at Robb Elementary School yesterday afternoon. I think we're all still reeling from imagining such horrors that continue to happen in our world. Right on the heels of another horror in Buffalo. So we do want to just start with taking a moment of silence for the families affected by this horrific event. Thank you. Thank you. Not what we want to start with, but it's the reality of our world. And know that for this incredible group of educators and advocates and leaders who are gathered in this room today, we want to channel our energy into how we can continue to make a better place for all of our kids to learn and thrive. And that's really what today's conversation is about. I don't need to tell anyone here that long before COVID, we had some serious problems in our education system, and those are continuing and only amplified now as we are taking in the effects of the past 2 years and continuing to deal with ongoing ripple effects from this pandemic. One of our passion points here at Kid Museum is how we continue to light the spark for kids and help them to persist and thrive in whatever creative pursuits they desire. And so much of our world, so much of our economy here in the DC region, but so much of the world in general is powered by STEM, and we know that STEM fields and innovation fields are essential for kids to have success in life and see what they can do to make the world a better place from where they sit. Yet we also know that there are incredible gaps in access and participation for people of color and youth of color. So just a few statistics to start off our conversation. In computer science, we know that just 8.9% of the 71,000 bachelor's degrees awarded in 2017 to Black students were in computer science, and only 10% of computer science degrees were filled by Latino students. In the same year, just 4% of all high school students taking AP computer science were Latina girls, and 2% were Black girls. These disparities don't occur overnight. They're set in motion in elementary school and middle school, and even before youth step into the classroom. We, I think, might have some of our colleagues here from Ed Trust in the room today. I don't know, but they were hoping to come. A recent study put out by Education Trust found that 2 out of 5 Black and Latino students report that they really enjoy STEM courses and aspire to go on to STEM fields, but less than 3% are enrolling in advanced STEM courses that would set them on this path. There's something happening in the systems and environments that our kids are growing up in that we're not supporting them adequately to pursue these opportunities. And that's really what today's conversation is about with this incredible group of friends, family, and fellow advocates in this work. We want this intentionally to be a small and intimate dialogue. Everyone in this room is playing a role in this in some way already. So while we have wonderful, esteemed guests to speak with us and set the stage, we do want to bring in this full community and not only diagnose the problem, but talk about how we move this forward. We'd like to stay focused on the K-12 environment in this conversation today. There's going to be a follow-up symposium, a sort of sister symposium at our partners organization at the universities at Shady Grove in late June. So we really want to stay focused. We recognize there's a lot to discuss the higher ed side of things, but this is really with the focus on the K-12 environment. So without further ado, I'd like to invite up and introduce our special guest who's joining us from Nashville, Dr. Ebony McGee. Dr. McGee is a professor of education, diversity, and STEM education at Vanderbilt University, where she studies the barriers to success in STEM education among Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students. Dr. McGee will be sharing some of the research from her most recent book. I had the pleasure of hearing her speak at a conference put on by the Lemelson Foundation last year and was just so impressed with her perspective and just thrilled to have her with us today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. Can you all hear me? Okay. I see some friendly faces and I see some new faces. And I just want to say how grateful I am to be in this space as opposed to the academic environments that I'm typically in, because these are the spaces that are most transformative in terms of informal STEM learning. So just thank you so much for thinking of me in this role. I have way too many slides to present, so if you see me skip some, I will certainly give you a copy of the deck, and I'll try to only skip slides that can be easily ascertained through reading. And I'm going to talk about the role of STEM identity. But first, I want to remind us, as Gloria Ladson-Billings, one of my mentors, founder of the Dream Keepers, reminds us, particularly in the last couple of years, that we actually have at least 4 pandemics going on. And the pandemic of anti-Blackness is one that we don't give enough attention to. And there is a very intimate relationship between gun laws, gun policy, gun history, and fear of a Black planet, right? So this is not disconnected to the tragedy that we saw yesterday and the tragedies that we'll see in the future. And I wanted to also pay homage to Dr. Ruth Gilmore, who talks about racism, state sanctioned, so like legalized oppression. And what it does is it ends in premature death. And this reminds me of so many Black women, but in particular, Dr. Lonnie Guinier, Dr. Bell Hooks, and so many others who, in spite of their awards and their accolades and their publications and up-team books, still are not here, and they deserve to be here. So I was talking to Mel, my colleague at the table, and he was saying he's a professor of electrical engineering. Great to meet you, Mel. And I, too, got my degree in electrical engineering. Yes, yes. And when I went to work, they were parts of me that I had to basically leave at the door. And parts that were really important to who I am and my identity. And I feel like, although I haven't done engineering, formal engineering in over 20 years, I'm still recovering from that experience. So I can only imagine, I don't really have to imagine what, students are going through. I am here to talk about some of my K-12 findings, but I have to talk about the culture of STEM at large. So I think that STEM has a superiority complex that is actually not beneficial to our society. It's not even beneficial to innovation. I'm learning much more about the history of STEM and how the history is grounded in militarism, grounded in warfare, grounded in domination, global domination, and these messages of beating China, or even the lack of collaboration with Russia is really hurting us overall and hurting our ability to innovate. I don't know if you all know that innovation has been largely stagnant since the 1970s. And I think, the culture of STEM needs to be indicted as part of this. And even if we tell Black and brown students that you'll make great money in STEM, you'll still probably make on average $10,000 to $30,000 less than your peers and your colleagues. And money certainly could be a motivation, but it is not the motivation. I'll get to that later in the presentation. So I study high achievers because I thought I was going to tell these glorious stories about folks who are achieving and happy, and they're not as happy as we think they are. Even if you're successful, you get this kind of Black exceptionalism or Black and brown exceptionalism, like, oh, you made it, or you must be a genius, or a freak of nature, or you're special, or you're different from other people, in your community, in your neighborhood. And even if you try to tell them, no, actually, the people in my neighborhood, some of them were a lot smarter than me, and they didn't make it here. Folks cannot hear and ascertain that message. So it again perpetuates the myth that STEM is there's only so many Black and brown and other minoritized folks that could be in STEM. I also kind of want to indict this pipeline analogy. And even though we are starting to give much more attention to the role of structural barriers, we still think about pipeline as like these little tiny leaks that are, kind of dripping out that we could probably patch. And a lot of people say as early as pre-kindergarten, but if you understand anything about Black maternal health, it actually is prenatal, right? We really need to look at the before life course in prenatal, because the reality is that some Black children are not going to make it to kindergarten. And if they do, their mothers might not be there. However, if 61 to 67%, depending on which statistic you look at, are leaking out of the STEM pipeline, this is white, Asian, Black, Latinx, that's not a leak, right? Can we argue that if the plumber came to your home and saw 67% of the water leaking out, he wouldn't say, oh, we can patch those. He would say, the pipes are corroded and we need to tear those pipes out. And it might actually change the foundation of your house. So if we can all agree that the pipes are straight busted, and it is really the piping that is the problem, why are we blaming the water? Why are we creating these covert deficit narratives to, cuss the water out? If the pipes are corroded, the water is doing what it's supposed to do, which is to leak out of this toxic situation, right? And we often tell students that you need to be more resilient, other kind of narratives that we give them, and we don't do anything about the pipes. So I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about a new framing of the pipeline, and I came up with a water part. Now, this is still in development. You are the first people to see this. But even as you go through elementary, middle school, high school, there are structural things that happen to Black and brown, and when I say minoritized, I mean low income, low resource schools and neighborhoods, LGBT communities, I mean white women and other folks who are minoritized. And I'm trying to kind of take each one of these pieces and put some narrative around it, not just talking about the challenges and the statistics, but also the forms of agency that students and teachers and parents have, within those environments. But like I said, even getting into the water park, right? So even getting into K-12, tends to be problematic, where it appears to be two different tracks. A track for mostly white and some Asian students, and then there's a track for Black and brown students. And, I'm still working on this. It's still in development, but this is part of the structure that we need to talk about. So even though I'm going to talk about STEM identities, I just don't want us to forget that these STEM students are operating in a structure that was basically not designed for them and continues to perpetuate that in various ways. So I want to talk about mathematics academic identity. And I am positing that to be Black and brown in mathematics in the K-12 environment is a fragile identity. And it's fragile because, not because you're not high achieving, because both in the fragile and robust, you are high achieving, but in fragile, you have different motivations. And the motivations are debilitating. So either you're defending yourself or you're defining yourself. If you're defending yourself, what you're doing is you're trying to prove to your peers, to your teachers, to the summer STEM camps that you go to, that you deserve and that you belong to be there, right? Whether if you're defining yourself and enjoying and embracing mathematics, just imagine a world where Black and brown students didn't have to worry about walking into a math classroom and proving themselves, that they could just do the math and love the math and embrace the math and have that intrinsic motivation. So you are mathematically high achieving, but it's sort of external. So if it's about proving somebody wrong and you do get the 99 on the test, it's not as intrinsic because you're doing it, you're putting it on the test and you're leaving it on the test so your colleagues can see it, your high school peers can see it, but it's bittersweet. It doesn't really come from an affirming place. And then you have these racialized mathematic experiences where in the moment, a student might do things to jeopardize their math success, like walk out of the room. And I'm not saying that that is not a bad response. Like when people are being attacked, they should be able to respond in ways that protect their identities, but this also causes them to miss out on mathematics or some other thing that might be punitive to their future. So I have all these slides kind of talking about this. Oh, and then of course the colors are changing, so we can't even see it. But I'm just gonna kind of skip through those a little bit and talk about a little bit about risk factors and protective factors. So I built my model of fragile and robust identities by looking at the risk factors that high school students in particular, but it certainly could overlap with the middle school environment, the risk factors that they face, and also the protective factors. Like when we think about, like where I grew up on the south side of Chicago, I had a lot of things that protected me. I had the village raised me. But when you hear that I was from the south side and I had a single mom, but she wasn't a single parent because I had uncles, I had other people, right? You hear that narrative, you think it's all risk. But I had a lot of things that protected me in that environment as well. And I think we don't talk about that enough. So here are a few of the challenges that high school students, particularly Black males, are facing. Of course, it was just mentioned, the lack of AP classes, and the career guidance, the college counseling services are really, really lacking. Where, if the college counselor is even a full-time person in the high school, that they're often funneling you to community college or skill development stuff and not to, places and spaces where you can really innovate and be seen as a leader in STEM. And then, of course, you have other challenges due to the lack of resources often in Black and brown neighborhoods that, impacts them. And of course, the lack of role models. I'm going to talk about teachers in a second. But you also have things that protect you. And over time, students develop certain kind of academic survival techniques like dressing preppy, or, big Black men feeling that they had a responsibility and obligation to kind of nod and smile. So it's hard to teach somebody you're afraid of, right? So they felt kind of reduced the ability for the teacher to be fearful of them and to actually educate them. Many of these students had a belief in the lifelong relevancy of math, and they really wanted to do math for volunteer reasons. They wanted to teach their cousins. They had a helping ideology. They had a really a tug of war between wanting to build bombs and better their communities, where bettering their communities was the ultimate goal, but they felt as though the way STEM was presented to them in high school, that there would not be room for that. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And then they have multiple passions. You see the Black male walking down the street and he's like cussing and rapping at the same time, and you're like, woo, let me just let him do what he does. That's actually a way to deflect violence, particularly with the school closings in Chicago. So the study was done in Chicago, that these young men told me that they had to do that to make it from point A, which is home, to point B, which is school. So I identified that as a protective factor. It's actually protecting them. And then there are some other things that I, kind of wish I could go into, but I'll just say real quickly, sports participation. We often tell our Black and brown kids not to participate in things other than STEM-centric stuff. And it actually is better for them to have a full life, to enjoy other things, to have other passions. And it actually looks better on the application for colleges, but we need better teaching and preparing parents and students how to look as attractive as possible when it comes to the transition to college. And oh, that's a repeat, sorry. And then I'm just gonna kind of say, the mental health of these students. These were high achieving students walking into the interview really cocky and confident and, like dang near conceited until you ask, like, tell me about a time where you felt like you were treated unfairly. And literally in the interview, these same young men and young women would like break down in the interview. And I saw what I believe to be, depression. I saw anxiety. A student had a panic attack, so I had to take him from the interview to the counseling center, right? So we need to really problematize success. So if a student has a 3.8 GPA, interned with General Electric, maybe went to Jet Propulsion Laboratory in NASA, but is paralyzed because they have Bell's palsy, that's not success, right? And working oneself to unrelenting levels of stress can actually change your physiology, and you can pass that on to your children. So I really think we need to really be attentive to those who are at the top of the academic hemisphere at their schools, because there's still stresses and strains. And I certainly don't want to forget about teachers in this realm. And basically, we've been hemorrhaging Black teachers over the past, 20 years. Even though many of our public schools are non-white, we still have, very high proportions of white teachers. And if you look over a couple of decades, you will see that the only number that actually you probably won't see because it's like really tiny, but again, I'll give you these slides, that Black teachers are the only demographic that actually went down. So they were at 8% and they went down to 7. So, and if you look at Black males, oh, I'm sorry, white people also went down. So we do have some traction, but the traction is mostly in Hispanic teachers, which I'm very happy to see, because I feel a sisterhood with my Latinx brothers and sisters. But certainly, there needs to be more traction when it comes to Black teachers. And then what are they going through? The ones that are there are often, the primary breadwinners in the family. When they try to teach a racialized education, not critical race theory, right? but just the history of race and racism in our country, when they try to teach historical facts, they get pushback and pushback from the highest levels in government, right? And then also, I don't know if you knew that Black women actually have the highest student loan debt rate, right? So if we really want to attract Black teachers, we certainly need to talk about loan forgiveness, or maybe just give them some grant money so they don't even have to worry about going through the forgiveness process. And Black teachers are actually more likely to be evicted than their white counterparts, more likely to suffer COVID-19. So these are certainly things that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about, the K-12 system. I am in the College of Education, and I just want to say on behalf of me and my teacher educators that we're not doing a good enough job when it comes to teaching about race and racism, and how race and racism can certainly impact the experiences of their students, and not just their Black and brown students either. I just think there's a downside to privilege for white students as well. And maybe that is what we're seeing, in our educational environments as well. So we spend a lot of time on management, which is like code word for managing Black and brown folks, right? Not so much the management of white and Asian groups, because they're stereotyped to be docile and contained. And even when they do something, the subjective ways in which they kind of get a pass, where Black and brown folks don't get a pass in the prison to pipeline, school to prison pipeline certainly deserves some attention. But we as teacher educators need to do a better job. So when I interview high achieving, mostly high school students, this is what happens. This is what they tell me is going on in their math and science classrooms. And of course, today I can't talk about everything on this page, but I do want to talk about imposter syndrome. Because if you're in high school and you're in an AP mathematics class and you're Black and brown, you have likely felt that you embodied imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome means that you're feeling like an intellectual fraud despite of overwhelming evidence proving otherwise. And there are, some solutions for that. So what imposter syndrome workshop facilitators say is that you can combat imposter syndrome. You can get rid of it. And actually it's all in your head. And remember, syndrome means like you're a little bit crazy, like something cognitively is not working. So what do we tell our students? You're just a little bit crazy. Elevator ain't going to the top floor, but guess what? You can do your favorite yoga pose. And we're arguing that you cannot yoga pose your way out of a structurally toxic environment. And how dare teachers and administrators put that undue pressure on students when they feel as though they are imposters. They are often positioned as imposters, right? So there's very few high school students that I interviewed who say, I walked into my AP classroom and I just immediately felt like an imposter. They don't say that. They say I was made to feel as though I was imposter. And I really think we need to stop telling students that they're crazy, because they're not. It's not just in their head, and they certainly can't meditate their way out of an imposter's environment. And we need to start fixing the space that breeds imposterism and not try to, once again, fix the students. I know fixing the students is easy, it's cheap, it limits the responsibility of the school, but it's just not a good strategy. I also want to say thank you, sis. Thank you. I also want to say, like, if I'm running out, like somebody just wave at me. I also want to say that these students are not just wallowing in despair. They are doing a number of things to kind of affirm themselves. But many of these things are outside of the school, right? So they're not getting a lot of affirmation inside of the school unless they're being told they're an anomaly, they're special, et cetera, et cetera. But there's two things that you won't see on this slide, two things that I used to actually study, and that's resilience and grit. Because really, without dismantling the necessities for unending levels of resilience and grit, which, by the way, It's not a do-it-yourself endeavor. So resilience is your risks in life and your external supports. It's not just internal support. You need external support, right? Otherwise, we are asking Black and brown high achievers to sort of work themselves again to that unrelenting stress, paying homage to Dr. Gilmore's definition of racism, which ends in premature death, is true. If you look at Black doctors, Black lawyers, those who are at the highest realms of success, they are dying 4 to 5 years sooner on average than their white counterparts, right? So I want students to be just as resilient as the white male who's got legacy parents, mama's a lawyer, dad is a doctor. Like, I want that type of resilience. So I'm not arguing for no resilience, but not this unending levels of resilience that is damn near killing our students, right? So these narratives about resilience, and the new cousin is grit, which is actually not even a thing. Look it up. We'll talk about that later. They are really not helpful. They are really not helpful. We got to push to something else. Now, I was writing about mental health in 2015, and there was an article that came out about my research, and it's in 2015 where it says, professor talks about looming mental health crisis, right? So like, listen to Black women, like we can foresee the future. And here we are in this litany of mental health, but I wanna tell you, I'm worried about how it's being positioned. If you go to a mental health professional about a toxic STEM environment and they teach you how to cope in that environment, that's not good mental health for me, right? So many of these mental health professionals are teaching us how to cope with traumas that we can actually get rid of. We can actually change those environments. So the stress of being academically high achieving and racially isolated and being last to pick, with the science projects don't mental health me out of that, right? First of all, you can't. And secondly, that's just not a good strategy. So I'm a bit concerned about how mental health is being positioned. But I also want to tell you that it's not just mental health. Like, folks are going through a lot of physical trauma. Yes, these are high school students with pregnancy difficulties. And I know that's complicated. But a 17-year-old having a miscarriage, like what is happening? Like, that is just, that was unheard of 20 years ago. So now we're, having these things happen. And one thing about high achieving folks, you all in this room are probably high achieving, so you can attest to that. You know how to hide it well. You know how to camouflage. You're on the cover of the high school magazine, right? You're getting awards. You're meeting the governor, right? There can't be anything wrong with you, right? Because you're the poster child for everything right. And what we're masking is, mental health things, the interaction with racism, sexism, and other isms. So I believe that these folks are placed at greater risk sometimes. Okay, got you. Thank you so much. The other thing that's happening is when you ask high school students, who are in STEM, who want to be STEMers, right? Because that's like when you narrow, like, I'm good in STEM, but I don't want to do STEM because I went to this internship and, it didn't work out. So now I don't want to do STEM. We really need to think about where we're placing our babies when we do these internships and stuff. Maybe they should all come to the Kid Museum, to have an affirming experience. But when they grow up, they want to do things that are very traditional STEM. But when you ask them, like, well, if you could do anything in STEM, what would you do? This is what happens. They have a caring, empathetic ideology, just like the Kid Museum. I read that brief about empathy being part of the construct that you all offer here. So they don't want to just be a chemist. They want to be a chemist for dark skin tones. They want to fight algorithms that penalize and sometimes kill Black bodies in the medical system, right? So they want to do these things. They want to intersect their STEM with some form of racial justice. And I call this equity ethic, where students often have their own experiences of discrimination. Remember, I told you one of the ways that they induce agency is through volunteerism, high rates of volunteerism, but they certainly also have a linked faith with those who are coming after them, or they want to be that Black teacher that they never had, and a sense of responsibility to leave the world and make the world a better place. And they demonstrate that through intersecting STEM and racial justice. Not like I want to do my STEM over here and I want to do racial justice over here. It's the integration of those two that are important. And I think this message is not being funneled through K-12 institutions where we talk about being a computer engineer or, working at Google. And I know, sis, Google got its issues, but I'm so glad you're there, right? But what about being a Google, like a Black Google, right? Why is the goal often to work for companies that really have competing values with Black and brown students' identities? So even though that presentation was like, okay, we got some issues, why am I still excited? This is my second to last slide. Why am I still excited? Because the future hasn't been invented yet, right? We are now living in the imaginations of mostly white males. This computer, how I got here, I rode on a white male-owned airline. I stayed at a white-owned hotel, and all of those things are STEM, right? Architecture, buildings. So right now we're living in the imagination. What if we could live in the imagination of Black and brown people? How much better would the STEM be? Not just for us, but for the world. And why do I think Afrofuturism is like the key to moving forward and something that should be instilled within the Kid Museum and within K-12 curriculum? Well, if it's good enough for Dr. Alondra Nelson, who happens to work for the President of the United States and leads the White House Office of Science and Technology, it should be good enough for K-12 environments where you are mixing like cultural aesthetics, philosophy, science and technology and history in a world that talks about the intersection of the African diaspora with science and technology. So this is why I'm still optimistic, and I want us to not only produce a STEM population, but I want us to produce STEM founders, STEM entrepreneurs, STEM innovators, STEM owners, STEM designers. And I am not an island. I got a whole crew back in Nashville, and I have a lot more free resources on my website, blackengineeringphd.org, although I do hope you buy my book. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to invite our panel up to join Dr. McGee on the stage here. And she gave us just a little bit to talk about, as we expected, so thank you so much. It's incredible research, and we really appreciate your sharing your thoughts with us. Please, our esteemed speakers, come on up, and I will quickly introduce who we have joining. I think many people in the room know many of the people on the stage, but let me start with introducing Bloogle co-founder, Dr. Shanika Hope is Director of Computer Science Education at Google and very proud Kid Museum board member. As part of the Google Brain team, Dr. Hope leads a portfolio of equity-focused programs, research projects, and initiatives to grow equitable access to learning. Dr. Monifa McKnight is the superintendent of Montgomery County Public Schools, which is the largest school district in Maryland and one of the most diverse districts in the nation. Newly minted Dr. Rudy Ruiz. Rudy just this weekend earned his doctorate from Johns Hopkins School of Education. In his day job as vice president and partner for FourPoint Education Partners, Rudy leads the firm's college, career, and life readiness portfolio. focusing on improving post-secondary readiness and attainment. He's also founder and CEO of Edifying Teachers, a new organization that's dedicated to building a national network of trained mentors to support new teachers of color. And my wonderful colleague, Byron Johns, will serve as our facilitator. Byron has been a leading advocate for educational equity for many, many years in Montgomery County and beyond. One of the co-founders of the Black and Brown Coalition for Educational Excellence and Equity, if I'm getting all of that right, and chair of Montgomery County NAACP Parent Council. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Kara. And this is an amazing group here, and I feel like the slacker with all my doctor friends here on this group. So that's an amazing presentation. So this is going to be hard to tee it up. Behind that, I did want to, because I've lived this. I'm an engineering background. I actually started in the 70s and was one of the first Black students to attend Georgia Tech, because Black people weren't allowed to go to Georgia Tech until the late 60s. So just to give you an example. One of the things that I did want to get this panel to comment on is since the 70s is about when, from 70 to 2000, there was a dramatic, steady increase in Black and brown engineers and scientists, just a progression of that. Since 2000, since the new millennia, it has been a steady decline. And one has to ask kind of what is the environmental factors to that. So can any of you speak to kind of your thoughts on what is driving that macro trend where we clearly had something that was increasing and now their function has gone into a 20-year decline?
I'm glad to kick things off there. There's a book you all may have heard of, came out, I think, about last year, called What Today's Kids Need for Tomorrow's World. And so if you put it in a framework, they talked about 4 C's, with the 5th C kind of thrown in by the fact that the author's colleague, an African-American woman, said there was one that's missing from what you have in most of the text. And so the first 4 were compelling enough in the sense that you had competencies, of course, you had credentials, of course, you had cash, which we don't talk about enough in terms of the financial aid, connections, which we definitely need to talk about more today. But then the 5th one is collective identity. And so I think, when you think about that era you spoke of, and, as folks were getting this confidence and identity to, understand their background and be, very proud of their heritage, we had folks celebrating different opportunities for people of color going into higher education. I think we've had pushback the last couple of decades on that, and there hasn't been as much of a collective identity for people of color in a lot of different ways. And so I think that that's a big part of it. One of the things that stands out to me as a Latino, and we have a number of sisters at the back table, from identity. And so when we think about identity, we have different narratives, right, out in the media in terms of folks talking about immigrants and people crossing the border. Well, I have news for some people. My family didn't cross the border because the border crossed us. We've been in the Americas for not decades, not centuries, but millennia, okay? And not only my people, but my sister's people designed and built pyramids and have been engineers throughout that time. And so when we think about who we are, that identity is really critical, and it's a piece that's been missing, unfortunately, in our K-12 students' experience these last couple of decades.
I'll comment as well. Good morning, everyone. Dr. McGee, your presentation was just honest. And I'll start there because I think it is the honesty that has to be at the center of the conversation for us to really get to the root of what some of the issues are. And sometimes because of the environment, the hesitancy, the outcomes that could probably come from honesty, we just don't get to the root of the problem quick enough. And you actually alluded to much of this issue in your presentation when you talked about those who, and Mr. Johns, I'll say, as you've gone through your career, I'm sure you could probably speak to challenges going through your entire career of probably being the African-American male within an organization, within a business, and ultimately if the culture or the norm do not embrace or support that, then some begin to question, what is my livelihood in a career that I've chosen that I have to interact with every day that does not accept or support who I am or what I bring to this organization? And so when we reflect on that, I think we have to listen to those who are in the field, who came into the field 10 years ago, acknowledge the struggles that exist within the workplaces and all those other ways, so that they can continue to be champions to their children and grandchildren to go into those fields. Because what parent is going to encourage their child to go into a field in which they believe that their livelihood, their happiness is not going to exist every single day, especially when they may have been a parent who've experienced that themselves? So a big part of what we have to do, and we have an opportunity to do that in the K-12 space, is make sure we have a reciprocal relationship. Not only are we responsible for preparing those students to go into these workforces and thrive and become those colleagues and career folks within the fields, but we also want to be the institution that helps our businesses understand, here's what you need to do to keep them there. And here's what we're preparing them for, but you're responsible for creating that environment that does continue to build them and others coming forward to work in these fields and in these career areas. So thank you so much for that question. It was a great.
Yeah, I'd love to comment as well. I think Dr. McGee really set the table for answering this question, which there were a lot of factors that I think contribute to the data that you just recently shared. But I think one important thing to call out is that the public school system, both K-12 and higher ed, is becoming more and more diverse. You look at the numbers and how the diversity of these institutions are more and more serving more students of color. But when you look at who's actually delivering the instruction, students don't see many individuals that look like them. So back to this idea of models, mentors, environments that students can see themselves, they see themselves belonging, they can identify with. I think that's a really important factor. I think the other thing gets back to, again, how Dr. McGee set the table here. When you look at a lot of the research, I think in Dr. Heidi Hayes Jacobs' work with Curriculum 21, there was some there's a data that said that the two contributing factors for a student's success on the K-12 side, by almost to the tune of 75%, is a highly effective teacher. So having a highly effective, highly qualified teacher, critically important. The second factor, which the data pulled out in her research, you would think it would be parents. But the second factor is leadership. It's the leadership inside the school. What are they doing to set the stage so that students, everyone feels welcome, everyone sees themselves, everyone believes that they're part of the curriculum and are part of the community, and there's access to rigorous curriculum. And so I think that interesting factor, when you look at a number of things that, in particular, starting with the institutions becoming more and more diverse, the fact that our systems and our structures have not adapted to the fact that we're now serving more diverse students, families, communities, I think that's symptomatic of what we're experiencing, what our students are talking about, even their lived experience, as Dr. McGee walked through. Can you imagine confronting all those systematic barriers and blockers, and then you studied high achievers? I mean, that is us, right? And that is my lived experience, all of the things that you've described. So I think that's what also is playing out in the data.
I think it's easy to think in a kind of assume in a diverse state like Maryland that some of the national numbers, the fact that 54% of current U.S. K-12 students are students of color, and yet only 21% of teachers and 20% of principals are people of color, to assume that that's probably not the case here in Maryland. Well, I've got news there as well, because here in Maryland, 1 in 5 schools has no black teachers, and nearly half of the schools in Maryland have no Latino teachers. And so again, when we think about identity, when we think about those protective factors, those pieces are missing. And when we think about some of the messages that may not be direct, but most certainly are frequent and indirect about what your future can look like, whether it be next semester, next year, or as a career, our students are getting those messages one way or another, and those messages are not providing those protective factors in that protective environment that Dr. McGee was describing.
I want to turn, that's an interesting point of some data here that says that leaving K-12, going into STEM majors, Black, Latino, and white students opt for careers or at least programs, STEM programs, at about the same rate, about 20%. But Black and Latino drop out, leave that before they graduate in those fields at a tremendous rate. 2/3 roughly leave that. There's many factors, but do any of you have any thoughts about if we're coming in at roughly the same rate, leaving the K-12, but not exiting, but again, back to your leaky pipe analogy, 2/3 are leaking out before they get through. Kind of, that's just an extraordinary relevance to this pipeline. What are the thoughts about what causes that, and obviously then, what do we do? What do we need to do about it?
I'll start with that one. I think the place we start in solving that problem is thinking about what accountability needs to look like for problems that we say we want to solve. So we can't just look at who are we getting into these programs, but then we have to look at how are they graduating successfully, and who are all the people that are at the very beginning of their start to the end that have either supported them or impeded their success. And I just had a conversation with just a college graduate parent yesterday who gave me a true compelling story. And she was sharing that her son was the only one graduating in a class from college of Econ 1, and it was an African-American student out of 432 graduates. And she said that her son, we should say, wow, it's unbelievable. She said that at one point, her student had a professor say, you should really think about changing your major. That's powerful. The culture that we have to create is one that says, we believe in you, we expect that you can do this, and we can support you. That has to exist in the K-12 fields, and we have to have representation that speaks to that. And then it also has to exist in the higher ed spaces. Because if students get into these programs and they are meant to feel as if they are not going to be successful, or the appropriate supports are not there to help them be successful, then we won't have them going into these fields of STEM, in which we continue to have the conversation. There's underrepresentation, but not getting to the why. So I believe the accountability is where we have to start to say who's getting in, how, and who are we missing, and why are we missing them intentionally? Who's graduating successfully? And when they're in these programs, how are we making sure that they complete those programs? And that's up to us to look at those numbers. And when we see them going in a direction that we're not happy with, address the issues that say we have to redirect what's happening.
2.5% of all engineering professors are Black. 1.3% of all engineering professors are Latina. 1.8% of all computer science professors are Black. In the last few years, we've only accrued 180 Black computer science professors. So, it is a problem of very, very deep concern that a person could go from a bachelor's, master's, PhD, go into a faculty position, be an assistant, associate, full, endowed, and retire, and never see anyone in that system that looks like them. Like, that is a crisis, right? That's a crisis of mass proportion. But we kind of accept that as the normal way the STEM plays out. The STEM culture needs to be indicted too, where the professor looks to the left, looks to the right, and say, one of y'all won't be there. Well, why not, right? And why is it always the Black and brown person that ends up not being there? So the curriculum is all jacked up with master and slave narratives, right? Like STEM needs like a complete makeover. But there's also something happening to these high achieving students, particularly in the freshman and early sophomore years, where they are failing for the first time. Not like failing the whole class, but they get that one F or that one D minus that they've never had in their entire K-12 career. And they're like, bump this. You know, first of all my teachers are don't look like me. The curriculum, I don't see myself in the curriculum. When I look at who the great STEM folks are, they're mostly all white men, or at least that's what we learn about. You know, I learned from Byron that they're not actually mostly white men, but that's another story. Thank you for that lesson, Byron. So, you know, they switch to something where they feel they can be more competent in, and they won't get those Fs. So people often say, well, let's do mindset training, you know, which is, it ain't as good as you think it is. Because a lot of Black and brown people cannot afford to take risks. You know, if you get an F, then that professor says, see, I know you didn't deserve to be here, right? So we got to think about outside of the mindset, what's going on with the environment that is not allowing these students to take risks or not allowing them to fail once or twice in a particular class.
Yeah, I'd love to comment really quickly on and build on a point here that Dr. McGee just made. So the lived experience is a very powerful tool as we talk about the accountability factor of educators and institutions that are serving students. This is not for hand clap moments. I'm currently pursuing another master's in computer science education at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm doing that because I love to learn, but I also want to stay tied into the lived experience of students, women. I like your word, minoritized. Minoritized. My first 2 semesters, and this is, UPenn's a great school, to be clear, but to this point about the first year as a student of color, oftentimes coming out of an environment where my teachers may not have been credentialed in the space of mathematics or science, come out of the high school experience, or not fully qualified to kind of provide that substantive instruction that I would need to lay a strong foundation. So I get into the higher ed space, feeling like an imposter, okay? Your first year typically is taught by TAs, graduate assistants, okay? They are stressed. You're typically in a class with 200 plus. My first course, 600 of us in this course, okay? So the amount of time and the quality that can be provided, I work at Google and lead a team of engineers, okay? So you would think, oh yeah, I should breathe. The devil is a liar. It was a difficult experience. So I'm being taught by individuals that are stressed, they're graduate students, they're too trying to complete their program. And so back to the word grit, resilience, like I have a support network that's helping me to push through, right? I'm also almost 50, right? So learning for me is different than when I was 18, 19, 20. But think about what that's like. An 18-year-old being taught by graduate assistants, many of which English is not their first language, and that's not a knock on the individual, but that creates blockers and barriers. And then you're dealing with all of the pressures that Dr. McGee laid out in her conversation, right? Of course, I'm not completing. And so these are the factors that we really have to have a bold, courageous conversation about. And it's all of us. It's not incumbent on the Shanikas and the Ruizes of the world to figure it out. We need a full ecosystem that is courageous enough to understand the lived experience and to say enough. So we're gonna put our best faculty in the first year set of courses because we want you to succeed. We're gonna provide you with supports and to give you the space to take risks and to say, you know what, I didn't understand why that particular equation worked. Or I didn't get my code to run after the 15th time. And so these are the things that we have to examine, is we need to show up with our best and not say, well, too bad, you got the D, you don't belong here anyway. Look at the pipeline, and I hate that word. Look at the path that I have. Look at your swimming pool analogy. Did you see all of the hurdles and the blockers that students of color have to encounter? That's real. And I'm living that today. and I'm almost 50 and I'm at Google, and that's my experience. And so that's what this conversation's about. It's about bold, courageous steps in telling the truth about the lived experiences for students. I'm quiet. I'm done. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Shanika, for sharing your experience. And I think, so much, every single slide, I think we resonated with us because we've lived it. I grew up, in the inner city up the road from Chicago and the inner city of Milwaukee. I had the opportunity to, commute 40 minutes to the magnet school in Milwaukee. So from 3rd through 8th grade, I had this really incredible, unique experience in those settings where I had, for example, a 4th grade black male science teacher where we were, dissecting cows' eyes and seeing ourselves as scientists and future engineers in different ways. Throughout that time, I had a great, whatever the number of that years that was, 3rd through 8th grade, that set me on a good trajectory, right? But then when I went to high school and my parents moved us out of the inner city and ended up going to a small parochial school on the edge of the city, I ended up being in that scenario right off the bat where I had to kind of spend those 4 years, defending myself, if you will, right? Where they're saying, oh, well, there's only a couple public school students in here. How are you going to do, right? And I'm, myself, I grew up wrestling, but it was funny because as a freshman, I was 88 pounds, right? Tiny little guy. And even the lowest weight class is 103, so that was like David and Goliath even at 103. And so they're looking at me like, who's this little brown kid who's, in all sophomore classes as a freshman? And so I'm having to kind of, defend myself and slowly but surely finding myself in that fragile state, right? And so I had all these years of protective factors that slowly over time kind of got worn down. And so even though I was able to, kind of prove myself and prove them wrong and, be valedictorian and get different options, and even though I'm proud that I'm a first gen college grad from Stanford, when I got to Stanford, you know what happened? I had two roommates who, one of them was the one that would point out and say, oh, you took calculus AB? That's nice. The rest of us were taking calculus BC. And so when I got that C, even though it wasn't a failing grade, and I've been hearing these messages, even at Stanford, even in a place where, I had a lot more students of color and I felt generally welcome, I kind of felt like, oh, well, I guess I don't really belong in math. I guess I really don't belong in STEM. And I took an easier route, really. Even though nobody told me to directly, I didn't have that support system. And so when we think about, again, what does a new village look like? And we think about support systems, the statistics and the research show students with a mentor are 55% more likely to enroll in college. And so when we think about what everyone in this room and everyone in the community can do, there's that power in that mentorship, right? Where having folks, not only like us, but others in the community who can say, you know what, you're onto something great. You may struggle, but that's okay. You're gonna be all right. That's so critical in this work.
Great. We're gonna try to continue along this focus because Kara told me that focus is going to be on K-12 and not, and she gave me the little hook here. So a couple of things to point out. NAACP did a nation's report card on technology and engineering literacy. Said 2/3 of 8th graders said they learned about building, fixing, technology, understanding how things work from a family member. And only 13% learned it from school or from a teacher and the like. So obviously for minoritized people who may not have the same familial structure or have historical access to people in these fields, that obviously is a disadvantage there. Can we talk about what is the role that K-12 education has in exposing kids at an earlier age to things like what Kids Museum is doing here, understanding, building, maker, that whole foundational piece. Because one of the telling things, and Dr. McKnight knows well, there was a study done in 2018 on our local school system, which, by the way, is one of the best certainly in Maryland and amongst the best in the country, that Black and brown students, 4th grade, are equal to their peers, but by 12th grade, 95% are in the lowest math track. If you don't have the math, you're not going to go, your road into STEM in the higher ed is going to be really hard. So can we just talk through your thoughts on the role K-12 and then obviously what are we doing, what do we need to do to deal with that end of the leaky pipeline?
It's definitely a pipeline that's been leaky for way too long. I saw Dr. Murray here. Dr. Murray is a principal in our system. And when I was completing my research for my dissertation, she introduced me to a book, and it was by Moses and Cobbs, and it compared the civil rights movement in Mississippi to students of color having access to algebra. And this was, okay, so this was done, and it led to the Algebra Project, okay? So this was in the 80s. ERS study completed in Montgomery County, I think the year before I came, 2019. Same issue. Students of color not having access to some of the more rigorous courses, particularly math courses, and we were looking at algebra yet again. So why are we still having the conversation? Because when you look at, we're talking decades of identifying a problem, but we're talking about the same problem. And we know in between all of this time, there are many who are responsible for making this shift. So how much more research do we need? We don't need any more research. What we need to do is change our practices and be bold about it, and be okay causing some discomfort. And I was one of the ones when I worked at the Department of Education. They said, what is your dream for education? When I first went there, I was like, to be transformative and to change all of the century-aged elements of education to be something different. Now, I did not ask for COVID-19, okay? However, how honored am I to serve at a time in which, because of the pandemic, it forced us to step back and change things that I don't know we would have changed as aggressively as we've had to change them or look at changing them right now. And so here we are in this moment. And so this has to start in the classroom. I was talking to Cara a couple of weeks ago, I think, and we were just talking about the vision of our work moving forward. And one priority that I share with her is that through Kid Museum, we've got to start the exposure earlier to students before middle school. And then we also talked about the importance of making sure they don't have to come to this space to get that experience. Now, we love this space, and we want to call it right now that we would like to congregate all of our children in this space because we love it just that much. But the bottom line is what they do here in this place has to exist in the classrooms. And so that means getting to and working with and providing that professional development for our teachers to say, how can we stop making this experience that's happening at the Kid Museum a provocative, exciting, special experience? And it is the experience of learning that needs to take place every single day that they can build on when they come here. And so that is about the professional development to the teachers. And that professional development is just about now, not how we expose them to robotics and coding and all of those experiences in the classroom, but also thinking about who our students are and how our own perspectives have got to not be filled with low expectations so that when we're looking at this student and this student and this student, we don't even observe the ways in which we're interacting with them that says, I don't believe that you can. And so that's where we start. In the K-12 space, providing the professional development, building the capacity of those in schools and in Central to say, what are we going to do about these issues? And in the schools, so we're very good, and I'm going to say K-12, at just implementing processes and procedures that we've always had in the name of this is just how we do work. So how do we determine who gets into what classes? Well, the school is the best place to determine that. I agree, because the schools are interacting with the students every single day, and they should know them best. But are we doing the work with the teachers, with the teams, with the counselors, and everyone to be able to say, what are you looking at when you make the determination about who gets it and how they get access to it or not? And is there bias in that process? And so really thinking and evaluating those systems to say, well, if the system has been built and we're getting the same results and the data that we've been getting, how do we turn some of those processes and procedures and systems on their head? or adapt them in a way to change the trajectory of where our students are going.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that point, Dr. McKnight. I think teachers are a large part of the solution here. I think we need to invest in teachers in a substantial way, but I also think we need to reset our mindset and our approach around where we place our best teachers. I've been a former principal, former assistant superintendent. I was a classroom teacher, so trust me, when I say this from a place of love and as a supporter and a teacher. But we put our best teachers in the more lush kinds of placements. So our best teachers teach AP. Our best teachers teach honors. Yes, but our best teachers need to be placed with the students that have the greatest needs. And I think that's how we begin to change. And we have to build a culture inside of K-12 that says we all win when all of our students win. This is not about, yes, and you've invested a lot. And to be clear, teachers, my word, teachers and principals are carrying a tremendous load today and always. But today in particular, and we're losing a lot of very strong teachers and administrators. We need to invest in our teachers and administrators. We need to stand with them, but we also need to give our students our best. And that's how I think we need to hold each other accountable, which is doing a bold thing and putting our best teachers in our classes where students may have the greatest kind of delta academically. So that's my 2 cents on that front.
No, I got excited when you started to say that. When you started to say that, because so as a community, we have to be informed. And we have to constantly be informed and say, what is our duty and responsibility to make sure that the very things that we're talking about right now can happen. So I'm very thrilled to be in the state of Maryland right now, in which we have the Maryland Blueprint, because it's built a pathway in so many different ways for us to be able to do some very innovative things that before we had to plead and beg and collaborate to exhaustion. And that says this is what you can do. And it gets to incentivizing our best teachers. So even when we think about incentivizing our best teachers, I'm still going to say, for who? For who? Because in the Maryland Blueprint, you know, one of the things that signifies a teacher's credential that puts them as a highly qualified teacher is to have National Board Teacher Certification, and that is amazing. I love that process because the one thing it requires our teachers to do is to reflect on their practice. And we all know that sometimes it's our teachers are busy and they're just doing the work that they do with students and they're committed to it and exhaust themselves in doing it. They don't have enough time to reflect. And we all know that it is through reflection and evaluation that we become better at what we do. But we then have to continue to say, okay, if we're putting our teachers in our best teachers, and how do we find our best teachers? Okay, because also, does that National Board Certification process really get at inequities that exist in the process? And if it doesn't, how do you create that? How do we create that locally? And then evaluate the process and continue to then say, what do we need to do to make sure that those teachers who we're putting in with our most high needs students, they stay? Because then there's a mobility piece that we've also seen over time. Our best teachers, maybe not our best teachers, all of our teachers, what we know is those who are in those high need schools, they do not stay. So why don't they stay? What are the stressors in that environment that we can fix so that when we do recruit them, we can keep them and they feel like the community of the school or the system is invested in them and their success so that our students can have stability? We should come back, Cara, and have just a conversation on that, because I think there's so many things that we do have to unpack around that and understand what are all of our roles as parents, educators, advocates, everyone to keep pushing on me and others and asking that question, how are we doing it? And identifying what are the barriers to keeping us from doing those creative and innovative strategies.
I'm so glad I have the chance to follow you on that. My first 8 years in my now 21 years in education were in the classroom as well. And it was based on that when I enrolled at Johns Hopkins 7 years ago, the problem of practice that I've been researching is around teacher retention, teacher attrition. And the biggest discovery was exactly what you said. We don't have a recruitment problem, we have a retention problem. And so while I'm really excited about the work that we're doing through edifying teachers to better support and retain teachers of color, I also know that it's going to take some time to move these numbers and to get the representation that we need to better reflect our student population. In the meantime, thinking about something that Dr. Hope's colleague, Jamie Cassup, has said, that many of you know, not to ask our students, what do you want to be in the future, but what problem do you want to solve in the world? And I think with what Dr. McGee shared earlier around the equity framework and the way that, in large part, our students of color think, it's what change do you want to make in your community. And so we have opportunities to start to blur the lines, which is what we need to do between, the walls of the school and the community, right? We've got opportunities to connect students, to do service learning, to do project-based learning, to work with Kid Museum and other groups and other mentors to be able to, get that support that they need to make this change.
I'm having a hard time just keeping in this seat. I'm about to get up and start foot stomping this stuff. So one last question, just really following up on that. So what's the role? And then I'm going to, for those of you in the audience, have a chance to ask your questions. But really, what's the role of the community and partnerships and collaboration in business community here in this area to really, as Dr. McKnight said, to kind of both support and push for this area? This is a future of the economy, the society, the culture, both locally and nationally and globally. So what's the role that you see community and advocates and others in helping to lead this effort?
Okay. I think community plays a really big role, and I think we downplay the role of non-STEM, a non-STEM support system. So when I ask high school students, what is their biggest motivator, like who motivated them first, it's often their Black male fathers. They say that their fathers are their first math teachers. So this debunks the notion that, first of all, fathers are not invested in their children's education, or they're not there, or they're missing in action, right? So their first math teachers are their dads. So here you have affirming culturally relevant practice that is not really being translated in K-12 schools. As a child, on Saturday and Sunday nights, and sometimes Friday nights too, my mom had bid whist games, spades games. Anybody? Can I get an amen? Okay. So there was robust mathematics happening 2 to 3 days a night in my household that didn't translate when I went to school, right? So I think we are missing out when we are looking at the Black and those folks who were playing spades and dominoes and dice and bid whist, they weren't mathematicians, but they were on their square. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they were on their game. So there is a lot of mathematics that happens in Black and brown households that I think deserves more translation in K-12 environments.
Yeah, I think the comment that was just made by my colleague here is that the blurring of the lines between school and community and the walls coming down. I think that's really the answer, and industry can play an important part by standing with schools in terms of providing mentorship, providing individuals that help students to see themselves in the day-to-day of technology or STEM. I think the other part, so building that sense of belonging and identity. The other piece is really the applied piece, like giving opportunities for students to actually apply the math that they're learning about, that I don't understand how we use any of this stuff in everyday life. By industry partnering with community and schools, can provide students those practical, substantive, applied ways to understand how in the world does Algebra 2 apply to anything that I'm going to do when I graduate. So those are, I think, are two important ways that we can do that. I think industry also plays a role with standing with nonprofits by helping to push on policy and using some of our influence in that way to really drive this idea of broadening access and participation for all in this idea of STEM and specifically in the computing education space. So those are the ways that I think about how community and industry can be a better partner to schools.
One piece I'll add while I'm, beginning to, get out there more on the diversifying the teacher workforce work. I'm kind of best known for the college career and life readiness work. And one of the technical terms that we use in that space around opportunities like these is work-based learning. And so when I was talking with a colleague who some of you may know, Dr. Carnevale from the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce about work-based learning, and telling him that I'm pushing for this, to go to scale so that all students have access, he said, yeah, I don't think that's possible. I don't really see how it could go to scale because employers and industry partners, they never seem to be able to make it work. And I said, well, yes, that's been the case, but we're in a new era. When we think about working from home, when we think about Zoom calls, and we think about opportunities for students to do things virtually, our young people are not our future. They're more immersed in present technologies than the adults for the most part. And so there are valuable things that high school students, middle school students even can do that do also, since there's technology involved, involve numbers and math. And so when we think about whether it be social media promotion, video production, there's a whole wide variety of ways that industry partners can benefit from connecting with young people. And young people get excited about doing things that are going to actually be out there in the real world. That's authentic learning, and that's going to make the difference to keep them engaged in school and on the trajectory that we've been discussing.
And I'm going to make a shameless plug for MCPS. I was just talking to Sean, who heads up their work-based learning office. They are in need of industry so that they can place more students in internships and apprenticeships. And so beyond what summer learning provides, because this is more than just the summer experience, it's a year-long experience. Shameless plug. Please reach out, MCPS. And I'm already on it for Google. We're going to figure out a way. Shameless plug. Please do that.
Well, let me build on that, because she just hit a hot button on me. Because it's not just the students, it's the teachers that also. How many of you, all right, so everybody's got a cell phone, right? I know everybody's got one in there. So my first job coming out of college was inventing this whole cellular industry. And, one of the problems, for those of you old enough to remember, whoever has had a call drop. You know why? You know why that call drops? And you know why? It's a phenomena. It's a radio, and it's been solved mathematically, which is why calls don't drop as much as they used to. It's called Rayleigh Fading. And it's a phenomenon where radio waves intersect and they cancel each other, or they bounce off of buildings, and that causes interference. And that's why calls used, to solve that was one of my first problems, and you had to have the math to figure that out. So in real world terms, that's what kids would appreciate. And we really need to make sure industry exposes teachers to that, because most teachers haven't really practiced. They don't understand, they know the mechanics, but they haven't had that experience. They would benefit, and then it would become a force multiplier of being able to teach kids based on real world practice.
So you didn't tee this up, but George Mason University partnered with Google recently to actually provide paid teacher externships. So teachers get a very substantive stipend. They're placed in local industry, work in teams for 4 to 6 weeks, and then they have a community of practice for a year. Mason stays with that community. They build curriculum together. They reflect together. And then if teachers raise their hand, they can go on to get their computer science endorsement, and all of that subsidized through the partnership between George Mason and Google. And we're looking for ways to expand that. So your point about investing in teachers and providing that real practice for teachers, absolutely agree on it. We need more of that.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. Now we're going to turn it over, because I've gotten the hook, I'm sure. All right. We're going to turn it over for the audience. And some questions for our panelists. Uh-oh. There.
So my question is this. I appreciate all of the conversation. I want to be just a little bit concrete and ask if the research says that elementary school teachers hate math, and that's why they became elementary school teachers. And the research also says that students who can't read at 3rd grade or students who can't do math at grade level at 4th grade don't get that skill built the rest of the way through high school. And I appreciate the talking about the students becoming unprepared and all of that, but we know in MCPS which students and what large number of students fall within that category of not being able to read or not being able to do math at grade level. We also know we're not catching them up. So if we're not catching them up, I appreciate the kind of global discussion about kids being unprepared and, geez, how do we do something about this? But 3rd grade, 4th grade, we got data, we got a bunch of teachers, we're getting 60% of the county budget. 3rd grade, 4th grade, concrete, could make a difference. I think that's a discussion, that's a starting point that I really hope we focus on. Thank you.
Can I cue you up for that?
Please, go ahead.
One of the things I think is really exciting about Kid Museum is a lot of times when we think about organizations and work in that space, it's referred to as in education the OST space, right? Out of school time, and so some people would we used to call that extracurriculars, right? Whether it be sports or clubs or other usually kind of optional programming. I think one of the wonderful things that I've been seeing over the years with Kid Museum and the partnership with MCPS is that it's what we call co-curricular, right? It gives a chance for those two pieces to be integrated together and interleave both for the students and, to your point, for the teachers. I definitely feel like things are on a trajectory here to where while my understanding of the partnership is that it definitely does target the schools more in need. I think I saw Shanika kind of responding that we wanted to reach all students at some point, right? To your point, and so I think there's definitely an opportunity to build on that and to not have it be something that if a parent chooses to take the opportunity after school and can make it work, then that student benefits. But to have it be something that is kind of by default for all.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ruiz. I'll pick up where you left off. I love how you all are being able to share the story of MCPS as partners on the stage. I love it. Ms. McMillan, I appreciate you raising that, and MCPS has been really forward-thinking in terms of how we use our investments, and I'm glad you brought that forward to close equity gaps that we know have existed, and even more so over the last couple of years. We really have focused on how we provide the programming to support mathematics and STEM opportunities for students who can't afford it by making sure there's something they need not worry about affording and providing that to them free. And particularly in our elementary schools, our schools that are designated as Title I schools, we look at those programs and say, okay, we want to make sure they are there first in terms of how the funding is used. And we do it in a way that we know it's influencing and supporting those skills that they need, but not in the way that has a stigma attached to it. And I mean, we do offer tutoring, but if you say to a student, do you want to choose to do math tutoring or do you want to choose to go to the Kid Museum, which are they going to choose? The museum. So some of it is about how we even frame the opportunities that make the students want to engage in them in a way in which it's not as though we are stigmatizing them and their skills. So I think that's a big part of it. In terms of the teachers and their professional development, I started out as an elementary teacher, and I felt like I learned math through teaching it. That was my experience. It was amazing, actually. And as I did that, what I recognized is I don't know that it's that our maybe some of them do not like teaching particular subjects when you teach all subjects in elementary to a certain extent, unless you're teaming. But what they have got to do is be able to have the professional development that is meaningful to them in a way that makes them feel comfortable in how they are teaching. And so that's when we get into the differentiated professional development, so that it's not one that only MCPS is doing in isolation, but we can do it in partnership with Kid Museum and businesses. Bobby Cannon and I were just having a conversation at the table before I came up. And gone are the days in which we just call teachers in a room, provide professional development. Here's this packet that we think is important, and get in a room and talk to each other about it. Actually, our teachers, and even in elementary, have to sit in the room with business owners and others who we're looking at them and really recognizing up front, we're getting them ready for a career. Well, if this third grade teacher does not know the career path you're getting the student ready for and how it is, how it should become real in the learning experience in the classroom, then we're not making meaning in how we do that. And we're going to need to depend on our business partners and others to come into the spaces of school to help us do that. So it's breaking down the silos is the first step to help us move forward in that area.
Another.
Yes, good morning. How are you all? Thank you for starting the conversation. My name is Barrington Bo Scott II. I'm also known as Coach Bo in the Montgomery County area. My wife is Cherise Scott. And I would invite you guys in a collaborative effort to continue the things that your village is doing. Meaning, my wife and I, we started during the pandemic a program called iSpot, which stands for Instructional Support Providing Online Training. And we went into this after 15 and 16 extensive years in the county as being mentors to kids. I've put over 225 kids in private school and in public school. And what I found is that there's a disconnection at the household and the school system. Reasoning being is that a lot of our parents are not knowledgeable about the opportunities that they can engage in career pathways within our school systems. You can go up to an average person and ask them, what does your kid want to be when they grow up? They'll say computer science, but they have no idea that Paint Branch is a pathway for computer science. So I think that having the conversation of not only engaging the parents, but the kids is very informative. And one of the things that we've tried to do is we take professionals like yourself and we create the platform like you all have done today, and we bring you in to talk to our kids. We've had successful programs such as Cyber Kids for K through 3, which we're doing, which we're teaching them cybersecurity after speaking to a professional from Morgan State, Arthur Willoughby, who said kids can be pushed at the age of 3 years old to learn cybersecurity. We also have a program called Pass Go, where we took the simple game of Monopoly and we're teaching middle school kids on how to invest in their future by learning the stock market, cryptocurrencies, real estate, financial management. So these are things that we make sure that we bring into our village so that when our kids are matriculating, they realize, hey, there's investment. And in our Pass Go program, we're setting each one of these kids up with a 529B account so that we're investing in their future. By the time they graduate from college, we plan on matching whatever they have accumulated as their scholarship. So my point in why I'm asking for this collaboration is that I think that it's twofold. I think that a lot of the reasons why our kids regress or they don't meet the fold is because gifted and talented starts out in kindergarten, but most people don't find out about it until the 3rd grade. So if you don't find out that your kid is eligible to go into a gifted and talented program at kindergarten, you're already to the conversation late, especially if it only applies in one school in the entire county. All of our kids are gifted and talented, and if you sit down and talk to them, I think how they're measured upon those, because for instance, my kid has had like 3 tests, already this year. And a lot of the teachers complain about having to test and not getting able to really teach. And I think that we need to be able to look at other ways of how we quantify the results of their tests. Multiple intelligences. Every kid doesn't learn the same way. Some kids are linguistic. Some kids are more visual. Some kids are analytical. So I think that if we are able to adapt to what they like to learn, and we've tried that. We bring STEM, and when we change STEM, we call it STREAM, because after talking to Dr. Steve Perry, he said, how can you push STEM when 63% of the African Americans that are in college, that are athletes, are on an 8th grade reading level, right? So we say science, technology, reading, engineering, arts, agriculture, and math, because it's important for them to go out and learn a little bit about culture, learn a little bit about agriculture, because that is the way of the future. So we would love to have all of you guys continue this conversation. And we're predominantly in the East County community, but we're developing out. We want to go all over. And we do serve those individuals that are part of the Title I, and we've seen the success rate. And I'm sure that if we all put in, then that conversation becomes multiple successes amongst all of our kids.
Thank you,
So-
Coach Bo.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any other audience?
Yeah, my name is Nicole Verdun. I'm a physician. My husband's a physician, and so I relate to a lot of, and I have 4 children, several some are in MCPS. One concrete thing that I'm thinking about as we discuss, just in terms of our students, I think guidance counselors are key, and bias training is key. I'm also from Chicago as well, but I think that this is key, because when I think about students that came through school at just various stages with me, and my husband as well, you know, he had some very similar experiences. Some of the times when people would drop off or drop the path, it was from experiences of people telling them they couldn't do it, or guidance counselors that weren't particularly positive. I mean, I went to Duke University. There was a guidance counselor there at the time that would discourage African American students. She's no longer there. But if I didn't have outside resources and people, and you know, a grandfather who was an orthopedic surgeon who was the first Black admitted to Syracuse University and then had to transfer to Howard because they didn't want somebody graduating from there. I had those experiences, and I think those things are important for children to have exposure to, but also to have people that encourage them along the way. And some of the counselors, I think, that are in the system don't necessarily understand their biases when they're telling our students that they can't do something. And so I just wanted to, you know, add that in. I think that's just an important piece. And I also want to say one quick thing. I think we need to leverage our community more. If there aren't necessarily parents like me, there's several that are in Montgomery County. If there aren't necessarily parents at a specific school, I think there are ways that we can think about community in a bigger way, where we can have our Black and brown students actually have exposure to other people in the community that are not necessarily at their specific school. I mean, there's social media, there's other ways that I think we can figure out how to leverage the community and leverage those relationships so that all of our students are getting exposure to people that look like them that are in STEM fields. Thanks.
Thank you.
I just want to say real quickly, there's been a great conversation on implicit bias, and I finally actually believe in it. But there's also just sophisticated forms of racism. Like, you know, implicit bias was, you know, had a wave of success because people could just say, oh, I didn't even know I was unconscious, I didn't know. But, you know, these are not like police officers that need to make split-second decisions if a stranger lives or dies. These are teachers and professors who spend countless hours with our children and get paid to think and to think about the world and to think about, you know, social and environmental forces. And what we're finding in more recent literature is that some of that racism is not implicit, it's just sophisticated. So.
Oh, go ahead. Right here, and then another mic. We have another mic? Go ahead.
I'm Walter Ellis, and I've been working with the Montgomery County school system for probably 15 years, last 15 years. I had a chance to deal with students very much like the coach. I'm not very young, so I come into the field STEM as a retired guy who made it through the system. Like you, Google, I did IBM. And like this guy here who's looking for places to put his students for summer jobs or for year-long interns, I did that with Montgomery County and some school systems, people here in the school system. In fact, some of my teachers formed the magnet program which turned out to be extremely successful. I mean, so successful that you can't get, you get 1,000 people, you got to choose 200. So while the magnet program was going on, I helped those kids who didn't quite make it, put them back on the railroad, both at the junior high level and at Blair, which is the senior high level. I'm a STEM person. This was my first location here. It's like home. There's a train that runs under this thing. And back in 1964, I was placed here. And there were no jobs for a person like me who had a mathematical background in this particular area. So they sent me to Houston to work on the manned space project. It was fascinating. I had to do the orbit trajectories and learned a lot. One thing I learned was you had to deal with people. And different people from cultures different from our own. In the South, I couldn't live next to where I worked. I had to live in Houston, in the city. But that had a blessing with it because my next door neighbor was Muhammad Ali, and I was a karate man. I will get on. In Montgomery County, there was a soccer team. And the soccer team was gifted. They were a very good soccer team. But if they were going to go to college, they had to have some tutoring or something to help. There was a coach who decided that he needed help. And he called upon Sabrina, who called upon me to go help them. Make a long story short, the soccer team that I had 10 seniors who were going. Some of them didn't even speak English very well. In about a year and a half, they all went to college. I think most of them graduated. I get notes back from them every soccer ball they hit, and some have gone on to make a career because they really needed college to make that a career. The soccer team that year won the county, and all 10 kids got scholarships to college. I'm very proud of them, and that teacher, who should be Teacher of the Year, who knew he needed help and got it. Enough. I'll talk to you later because I know a lot of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. McGee, you started with something that really struck me as a quote, that parts of your identity that you left at the door as you became, a scientist and engineer. And clearly when it comes to producing classroom material, I work at Smithsonian at a center that studies invention. Would love to have you in at some point to see how we try to do it. Showing role models, showing African-American, Latinx scientists, engineers in the classroom materials in invention space is important. And so we're doing that actively now, right? So, and I even see it in my daughter's freshman year in high school in Montgomery County School. And the science materials really begin to reflect this change compared to a decade or 2 decades ago. But what else about identity needs to be brought into the STEM education materials that kids resonate and don't feel like they have to leave part of themselves behind? Are there other, I kind of believe in, to some degree, in change from the bottom up. Like, what other small steps can we begin making basically immediately?
That's a good question, and I would love to come to the Smithsonian. First of all, thank you so much for thinking of me in that capacity. So when you look across a basic STEM curriculum and you look at the pictures, they are mostly deceased white men, right? And this is the narrative that runs through the STEM culture. STEM programming often teaches stealth assimilation, right? So, these are what we consider mentoring programs. So we don't want to certainly reproduce that where you're talking about, how to land a job, things that are more neutral, but you're also talking about, your red hair, you maybe get rid of that. Get rid of that Cinco de Mayo tattoo you have. Make sure you wear long enough. So we tell students, Black and brown students, things that erase who they are, right? Erase their very existence. And this is really, really, really damaging. And we know that there's another history. Even during enslavement, Blacks invented things. Do you want to know what happened? The inventions were buried, they were stolen, or the inventors were punished. Now, the first two make sense. The inventions were buried, but why would anybody bury an invention that could actually, help out the enslaved, the slave master? Inventions were stolen. We know about that stolen legacy, but the inventors were punished. So I was trying to understand, well, why are the inventors being punished for being innovative? And then I looked at Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste, and that the reason why they were punished because it didn't uphold the stereotype of Blacks being innately inferior. So folks were punished for being innovative. Lisa Cook has another study, who actually also works at the White House, that in the 1870s, Blacks and whites had the same number of patents, almost. And then between 1870 and 1940, the Blacks disproportionately low number of patents. Three things happened: Plessy versus Ferguson, separate and unequal; lynching. So now we know definitively that people were lynched for being innovative, for starting their own business; and the Tulsa Massacre, which is a living legacy example of people being burned alive for being doctors and scientists and seamstress, which I believe is STEM too, right? So, that erasure of culture. Let me give you one more example. Higher ed STEM courses, 1676 Harvard, 1718 physics, mathematics, on and on to 1962 computer science course at Purdue University. What were my people doing? We were enslaved. We had a little period of Reconstruction, Black codes, Jim Crow. So there are centuries of Black and brown folks being out of the STEM knowledge production, right? That's why I argue for reparations. Centuries of us being excluded. There was one more thing I want to say, but I forgot it. If I remember, I'll come up to you and say it. Thank you.
I'd love to add an industry perspective there. So I previously worked at Amazon prior to joining Google, but both Google and Amazon, and I'm sure many tech companies, have done a number of studies where we've looked at entry level, so new grads into this, what we call SWE, software engineering, but that early career tech track. And we did these cohort studies of students that have come in, specifically looking at students of color and women. And what's fascinating in this study, so back to this idea of belonging and identity, there was this notion of privilege in the language, the absence of cultural signals that says your culture is reflected here and belongs here. All of that was absent. And so many of our early career diverse talent, and this is and I know directly for Amazon and Google, that privilege, and in our studies, it was, a quote from several of the engineers we interviewed, talking like rich white people. They didn't understand even how to do that. And so they didn't even understand how to talk to their colleagues because they didn't speak the same language, they didn't have the same interests, nor was it invited for their experiences to be included in their day-to-day. And so back to this identity and belonging, it's really about an intentionality of everyone's collective voice and collective experience being captured in the learning and in the journey and in the teaming. And it's intentional. You have to, it's a muscle you have to flex, and the culture, the environment has to hold a level of accountability that we are a collective community. And your voice matters, and if it's absent, we are responsible for making sure that voice is captured. As a leader at Google, that idea of what voice is missing, we are responsible for that. And Google holds us accountable to that. And we model that and hold our teams accountable. for that very thing. So that's also part of this belonging and identity that's actually playing out once you get on the job side. So I just wanted to add that.
I just want to say one more quick thing. I remembered it. So the cake is that Black and brown STEMers are knowledge builders, we're theory makers, we're innovative. The icing is that we're mentors and role models. So don't forget the cake, right? We are here for our intellectual abilities to build, to innovate STEM, and we also wouldn't mind being role models and mentors.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Jones-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of Nation of Makers. And I just wanted, like, everything you said has resonated deeply. I'm like over here, nodding vigorously. I grew up very poor in housing projects in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And when I think of all the things you presented, that's like my life, the imposter syndrome. I'm like, yes, this is what I experience right now. And when I was thinking about everything you're saying, it really boils down to value and value proposition. So when you're thinking about the students and the parents and how you see yourself, right? I think a lot of times we have these conversations, and one thing I would really implore everyone is to not necessarily think from a deficit model, right? We think, oh, these kids are deficient in so many ways, but they also come to the table with so many things, and you just spoke about a ton of them, like the games that we play at home, the types of making that we do. When you're really poor, you make a lot. You do a lot of math and engineering. I learned how to solder because I wanted a keyboard, a Castone keyboard. I was a child of the 80s. I was born in the late 70s. Really wanted a Castone keyboard. Couldn't afford it. My dad worked at the Salvation Army, brought one home, was like, this does not work, but let me teach you how to fix it. So he was my math teacher. He was my engineering teacher. And, you know, at the time, I didn't really think, we didn't have language around the word maker or any of that stuff, but that's what I was doing. I think when kids come to classrooms, we say, you don't know anything. I'm the teacher. I understand this. This is where this is coming from. And really, we're not presenting the value to them, that you have value. And I want to see how you see the world. The problem we have can only be solved by you. So if you don't do this math, we're in trouble. We lose out. We don't get the answer to climate change. The world just heats over and dinosaurs start roaming the earth. I'm making up stuff. But the point is, you get it. You know, as a scientist, I can't believe I just said that. But anyway, the point is that we need to be able to empower not just students, but teachers also to see themselves as change makers. And I think, you know, that's the value of Kid Museum. As someone who runs Nation of Makers, that's the value of all of these different maker spaces around the country, to actually do this work, to actually position children, adults, families as change makers for their communities. So I guess the thing I wanted to say to everyone is, as we're sort of closing out, is thinking about, you know, how do we take what we've heard here and how do we make sure that we're moving away from a deficit model to a model where we're showing the value of all children, especially Black and brown children, who really come from families that have a lot to give and not our deficit. You know, maybe they're deficit in computer science or coding, but they aren't deficit in a lot of other things, and placing that value in those types of things. So exactly the intentionality you were talking about. So I think, you know, to Smithsonian gentleman over here, you know, one thing is actually making sure kids see themselves, and that's not just older people that have done this already, but talking about youth that have made change, right? So they can see literally somebody who looks like themselves, and creating exhibits where you're saying, what are you doing? You know, those are the most powerful ones, the if, then, all of that. So anyway, sorry, I'm just excited that you guys are all here, and thank you so much, Cara, for allowing this.
May I just say one thing to that? I want to appreciate your comment and elevate one thing one area we're focusing on in Montgomery County Public Schools, and I think we all have to figure out how we do this as a community, and it's that we can't place the things that we're talking about today and say that we are then going to place value on it and how we work with our students and how we work with our teachers, but we also have to place that same value on our families. So if you are a parent, and we just talked about all the ways that parents are teaching and probably don't even recognize that they're teaching, we have to elevate that for them and show them you are bringing value to what we are doing with your child. Because we can't see the children and not see their families and parents. And I do believe that that is an area that we have to highly focus on after the pandemic as we think about ways that we continue to build these connections, because our parents will become more engaged and will feel like they can do more than what they're doing when they are feeling valued. And they don't have to be in these fields that require them to have a 4-year degree or a master's or a doctorate to be able to do it. Thank you.
Well, I think we're at the end of our program now. So first, let's give our panel a hand. And then panel, let's give our audience a hand. And Kara, you want to close us?
Thank you. And let's give our facilitator a round of applause as well. Self-Admiration Society here right now. We thank you all for being a part of this. It is incredible conversation, and while the amount of time we laid out seemed like a lot of time, we ran out of time. There's way too much to do. This is the beginning of this conversation, obviously. I want to close with 2 invitations for you. One is an invitation to please join us after for a tour of our space. If anyone has a few more minutes, we'd love to share that with you. The second is on June 4th, we will be at Universities at Shady Grove at our partner location, celebrating exactly what we've just described. We have our Middle School Maker Challenge. We've had 1,500 students participate in this challenge this year. This is their student showcase, and it's an opportunity for them to share with parents and with the community their inventions to protect life on this planet. So giving kids exactly the opportunities we're talking about and celebrating them, but celebrating their parents and their teachers who have been a part of making this happen. So please join us, and we will send an email follow-up around that. This is a space in here that's open to families on Sundays, and it is a space that we are working very intentionally to try to welcome families in. So please talk with us about ways that we can connect with families that you know, and we do have opportunities for free access. There is a ticket charge, but there is also, thanks to our generous donors, access for families to come in. So please be partners with us in making that come to life. And a special thank you to our colleagues from the Children's Opportunity Fund who have co-hosted this with us today. Kimberly Rusnak, thank you. That's a wrap. Thanks all.